Hello, I'm Tom Hauser. There is officially less than 1 month to go in the legislative session, and in that time, lawmakers must agree to a 2-year budget plan with the governor. Those negotiations are just getting started, along with more debate on some other controversial bills.
It'll agree to.
The Minnesota Senate passed a so-called preemption bill, prohibiting local governments from passing their own minimum wage and sick leave laws.
A patchwork of inconsistent labor standards from city to city or county to county or both cities and counties would be extremely confusing.
Republicans say the bill would be a burden on businesses, but most Democrats say it restricts the unique situations in each local community.
When we see a bill that seeks to unify or say put forth some uniform standards, that's denying the diversity and not recognizing the diversity of our wonderful state.
Protesters demonstrated outside the Senate chamber before the bill passed. The House passed a similar bill, but there are enough differences that a conference committee will have to work out a compromise. Governor Dayton says he hasn't taken a position on the issue yet. The governor did meet with House and Senate Republican leaders about the budget, and he wants them to work out compromises on their budget bills before he gets involved.
After they reconciled their budget differences, have one budget that MMB signed off on, so we're starting with a straightforward comparison.
Republican leaders say the governor needs to get involved sooner.
Minnesotans will be better served if the governor's at the table negotiating immediately and not sitting out. So my hope is that he will be engaged.
The session deadline of May 22nd may seem like a long ways off, but if there isn't willingness to compromise, that time can evaporate quickly. There is some new hope for a compromise on the Real ID issue. A conference committee began looking at differences between House and Senate bills, but lawmakers need to act soon on this. Starting in January, you'll need a Real ID compliant license to get through airport security or enter military bases and other federal facilities. Lawmakers and the governor have been at odds over whether undocumented immigrants should be banned from obtaining a Real ID. The chair of the conference committee says there's a compromise in the works that will set that issue aside.
Real ID is not about driver's license for undocumented immigrants. It's about a Real ID bill so Minnesotans can fly and visit federal buildings and military bases. We do have a belief.
Governor Dayton says he's willing to sign a compromise Real ID bill that remains silent on the issue of driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. Lawmakers have been debating for years on how to pay for repairs to Minnesota's roads and bridges. We often hear arguments for more funding regarding the economic benefits like job creation. But this week, the focus was on the life or death importance of highway improvements.
Drivers make mistakes, but it shouldn't be a death sentence.
More than 400 orange cones on the Capitol steps represent people killed in traffic accidents in one recent year in Minnesota.
One was my uncle. I put him on a gurney as he breathed his last. Another was my classmate's father.
Transportation advocates gathered to push for a boost in transportation funding to make highways safer. Among them, a woman whose husband was killed on Highway 14 in 2012.
My husband, Scott Hodgman, was coming home from work that night and was killed on that 2-lane stretch.
Beth Hodgman of West Concord in southern Minnesota has been fighting for more funding since her husband's death.
It's 4 lanes and then it's 2 lanes. It's not well marked. It's a visibility. It's curvy, windy, hilly, and it's been named a highway of horror.
The Senate proposes $3.6 billion for transportation over 10 years. The House proposes $6 billion.
We have a substantial bill that does not depend on raising new revenues.
Republican lawmakers favor using existing general fund revenue and borrowing money. Transportation Commissioner Charlie Zelli still prefers a gas tax increase.
Don't stand for one-time funding. Stand only for long-term, sustainable, and self-funding in order to keep our state prosperous.
But this week, Governor Dayton acknowledged there is little support for a gas tax increase in the legislature.
He has made a substantial statement in backing away from a gas tax, and we accept that at face value.
A House Senate Conference Committee began working on a compromise transportation bill this week. It won't be easy, though. The House and Senate have a $2.4 billion gap in how much they want to spend, and neither wants to spend as much as Governor Dayton. A piece of funding left out of a Senate budget bill could put a growing Minnesota food assistance program in jeopardy. It's called Market Bucks. The program matches the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, benefits spent at farmers markets across the state. That gives low-income families more to spend on fresh local food. The nonprofit Hunger Solutions says last year 85 farmers markets around the state participated in the Market Bucks program. That's up from 49 in 2015.
To get people access to great quality local foods, to get farmers more business, and to really build community, to me it's this example of government doing really good for people.
While the $325,000 to fund Market Bucks still exists in the House, it does not in the Senate. But there has been bipartisan support for the program in the past, a hopeful sign for people who use that program. More than 100 people rallied in the Capitol Rotunda on Tuesday to support House DFL Minority Leader Melissa Hortman. It came after some House members called on Hortman to apologize after making this controversial statement during a floor debate earlier this month.
I hate to break up the 100% white male card game in the retiring room, but I think this is an important debate.
Hortman made that comment after some members missed several speeches made by female colleagues. Last week, House Republicans released a protest and dissent letter over Hortman's refusal to apologize. On Tuesday, Hortman and two other DFL House members responded, arguing that race and gender were relative to the debate. That debate was over a bill to increase penalties for protesters who block highways. And we want to take a moment to pay tribute to a member of Governor Dayton's administration who died this past week. Commissioner Josh Tilson led Minnesota's Bureau of Mediation Services. This is video of Tilson back in 2011, shortly after he was appointed. He'd served in the department for nearly 30 years. Tilson died Tuesday due to complications from a sudden staph infection. He leaves behind a wife and 3 children. Tilson was 67 years old. Later in the show, we'll have Andy Brehm and Ember Reichgott-Young here for political analysis. And up next, we'll be joined by Minnesota Republican Congressman Jason Lewis. We'll discuss the latest on key issues being tackled on Capitol Hill, including the repeal of Obamacare. We'll be back in 2 minutes. And welcome back. We're joined today by 2nd District Congressman Jason Lewis. Congressman Lewis used to be a familiar face on this show as one of our contestants on Face Off. What, combatant, contestant? I'm not sure what.
Yeah. How about contributor?
Contributor. How about that? Let's go with that. Well, thank you for being here. Let's start by talking about there is this continued controversy, mostly created by your opponents, who are harshly critical of you for not having a public town hall meeting. You've done some tele-town hall meetings, and
right.
you've given many speeches. You do a lot of visits in the district, but why not have a public town hall meeting where anybody can come and really tell you whatever is on their
mind?
Well,
the first obvious answer is we've been tied up in Washington. This has been a very hectic schedule. I know members of Congress that have gone years without town halls, and we've been here 8, 9, 10 weeks. Seems a little bit early for that. But look, just this week, I met with literally hundreds of constituents here on recess. We do that every single day. We do the teleconference, so I call them. They meet in my office here and in Washington. I've got a responsibility to be responsive to those constituents, whether they be Republican or Democrat. I probably don't have a role in hosting the first Democratic rally of 2018, though.
Now, let's talk about one of the events you appeared at. I think you were talking to a Dakota County Chamber of Commerce event down in Apple Valley, and a number of the people who want to encourage you to have a town hall meeting were there to greet you. And you did go up and engage with them, and you tried to explain some of this, and here is some video of that. And were you able to satisfy them that yes, you may have one eventually, but I think you also have voiced, as you just did now, that there is some concern that they just want to turn this into a rally against you.
Understand, if you do a town hall or have this engagement, you got to be reticent to the other people or considerate of the other people. I want to make certain they don't get drowned out. So you don't want a spectacle where the people that actually want to communicate with you are prevented from doing that as well. But, you know, it's funny, this group, wonderful people, I've talked to some of them individually. I've called them individually and said, hey, I'm here, I'm talking to you, what do you want to talk about? And they said, well, I want you to hold a town hall with 100 of my friends. Well, I'm talking to you now, let's talk about the issue. Well, I want you to hold a town hall. So, you know, you get the feeling after a while it's really not about some of the issues, it's just how can we get our 15 minutes.
And you've seen many of your colleagues in Congress who have gone back and done town hall meetings, and you've seen what has happened. But having seen that and having said what you've said, will you be having one in the near future?
I'm sure we will. I don't know when. I'm sure we will. We're going back now to Washington. We'll have a hectic schedule all summer long as well. But look, this is going to happen. There's no question in my mind. We talk to constituents every day, every recess, every day while I'm in Washington. So the communication lines are open. The question is, how can we fit it into our schedule? How can we make certain everybody at the town hall can communicate and not get drowned out and things like that?
One of the issues I know you're hearing a lot about, and in fact, when you were talking to those protesters, one of the things they wanted to talk about was health care reform. Now, there is a new amendment, the MacArthur Amendment, I think is the latest iteration of this. What is the latest plan in Congress? I know it hasn't been formalized yet, but to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
Well, I was a supporter of the American Health Care Act in its first iteration, but now Representative Meadows and Representative MacArthur with the Tuesday group, Meadows on the other side of that spectrum, they're negotiating, and this would give states a greater latitude to either implement the 10 essential wellness benefits that are part of the Affordable Care Act that some people want to see continued, or not. It would reserve to the states, look, this ability to devise the kind of insurance you want.
What are some examples of these essential benefits?
Pediatric dental care for people that don't have children. When you have to buy some of those things, or gambling addiction treatment, things like that, that sound great, and people ought to be able to buy those if they want, but if everybody has to buy them and people that don't need them have to buy them, it drives up the cost of insurance.
Now, it sounds like in this latest plan, as it's, again, in its embryonic stages, but it would still maintain that people could stay on their parents' plans until they're 26,
right.
And they could not deny people for pre-existing conditions. Those are two of the things that people, I'm sure most of your constituents would agree should stay in.
And that was in the American Health Care Act that I supported and the leadership supported. We undid some of these mandates. We undid the price controls. We put a lid for the federal taxpayer on Medicaid. We certainly equalized the tax code. You know, right now, Tom, if you work for a big company, your health insurance, you don't pay any taxes on it. That's the single largest loophole in the tax code. But if you're an independent or you're out in the independent market, you don't get that same tax treatment. We equalized that in this bill. Those things, though, that you mentioned were in the original bill, and they'll be in this bill as well.
And it sounds like there would also maybe be some block grants available for states for high-risk pools that might help keep the prices down?
They're called state innovation grants. So we had a very, very good high-risk pool in Minnesota before the Affordable Care Act. It was essentially undone by that. We're giving the option to states to reinstitute those high-risk pools.
Now, and one of the reasons I think this is coming back, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, is because although the President Trump had talked about wanting to go back, skip over health care, we'll go straight to tax reform, it's hard to do meaningful tax reform without doing health care reform.
Understand, when the Affordable Care Act, and they took that $700 billion out of Medicare to help fund the Affordable Care Act, they said the cost would be about $1 trillion. Cost is way north of $1 trillion. Nobody knows for certain what it is. By doing this global health care reform that goes back beyond the Affordable Care Act, it goes back to HIPAA, it goes back to 1965 and Medicaid, it goes back to World War II wage and price controls. By doing this, we're told by the CBO and others that we'll save roughly $900 to $1 trillion. The plan is to take that $1 trillion to flatten the tax code. So instead of 7 rates for a small pass-through business in Minnesota, we're going to compress that to 3. We're going to repatriate foreign profits from the C Corp side and take that rate from 35 to 20. But you're right, we've got to use the savings from the health care reform to do the tax reform.
All right, so that's why the talk is shifting back to health care reform before tax reform comes up. Now, a couple of other big issues that I know there's a lot of concern about in Congress. President Trump's handling of the situation in North Korea and in Syria. Let's start by talking about North Korea. He certainly seems to be taking a much more aggressive approach with North Korea. Where do you stand on that?
You know, every president inherits something that he or she wasn't expecting. Everybody thinks it's going to be health care, it's going to be this, it's going to be the Middle East. My gut reaction, and I don't have any inside evidence, is he got to the White House and all of a sudden he's briefed on North Korea, and it's one of those uh-oh moments. Here's a guy that is not a rational actor. He's got nuclear weapons. We've tried to negotiate with the agreed framework during the Clinton era, then during the Bush era, the Group of Six, and he's violated every aspect of those agreements, and now he has nukes. I am encouraged somewhat by China's reaction to this. China, for the first time, is now saying, you know, we may do our part in getting a handle on North Korea. That has to happen. And, of course, the other big actor in the region is Japan. Since World War II, they've had a limit on their military capabilities, the post-Constitution or post-World War II Constitution. But they are absolutely terrified of what could happen on the Korean Peninsula. So we've got to get a handle on it.
And then finally, on the Syrian issue, did you agree with the bombing of the air base in Syria and the more aggressive approach there in trying to get rid of Assad?
It's certainly understandable when you see those horrific pictures of chemical warfare being used, why the president did what he did. But before we send any more sons and daughters from Minnesota to fight a protracted conflict in the Middle East or any place else, Congress has to debate that.
So you think before he goes any further, you would like Congress to be involved?
Well, I mean, any further, there's some latitude with what the executive has. But before a meaningful engagement like the ones we've had in the past, I want a congressional debate.
All right, Congressman Jason Lewis, thank you for sharing your time with us today. We do look forward to the time sometime in the future when there will be a town hall meeting. We will be there to cover that as well. But I'm glad you were able to share some of your thoughts on many issues. I know you got a lot of other things going on. We'll have you come back and talk about those another day. Congressman Jason Lewis. We'll be back with political analysis in 2 minutes. Well, this is an honor we're really proud to share. The School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota will soon become the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. The U says the Hubbard family, which owns 5 Eyewitness News, along with dozens of TV and radio stations across the country, has been a pioneer in the broadcast industry. That includes establishing the nation's first nightly newscast back in the 1950s.
They have played such an important role in the history of broadcasting in the Twin Cities and indeed across the United States, and we're just so proud of their long association with the university.
And the name change officially takes effect on July 1st in time for a new class of students to start at the school. And congratulations to the Hubbard family on a well-deserved honor. They have been very dedicated to the University of Minnesota for many, many years. Now, let's talk about Congressman Jason Lewis was just here, and as you both know, he's been criticized, as has Republican Congressman Eric Paulson, for not holding a town hall meeting. Ember, how important is it that they come back and have a town hall meeting where anybody can show up and express their pleasure or displeasure?
Well, any congressperson represents Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, and they all need a chance to talk with their congressperson. I think it is important to do so. Maybe it's just not that the time is right now, but he really does need to do a town hall meeting.
And it sounds like he will do one, but he also made it pretty clear he does not want to be the first campaign rally for Democrats for the 2018 election cycle.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, I think both congressmen have made themselves very available. I mean, Congressman Paulson was actually taking calls himself during the health care vote, so I don't think there's an accessibility problem, but I do think town halls are important for our country and our democracy, and so I think there's something that we should have.
Now, at the state capitol, the Minnesota legislature came back after their Easter Passover break. They've got a week under their belts now as they try to work toward a budget compromise, Ember, which, as you know, is the one thing they have to get done by May 22nd. They say they've had all these earlier deadlines. They say that they've passed things earlier than usual and that this is going to help avoid a meltdown at the end of the session. Do you buy any of that?
You need to understand that in the legislative process, you cannot get anywhere on the multitude of details until that big deal is done between the governor and the Republican leadership. And that means how much money does each committee get to spend? If that gets delayed and delayed and delayed, it doesn't matter. And that only gets done when there's a deadline. So having it 4 or 5 weeks ahead of time doesn't always work because you need a deadline to get to that major overall deal.
And the governor has made it clear this week that he wants the House and the Senate to work out their differences first, and keep in mind they're both controlled by Republicans, and then have one negotiating position before he will get involved. Speaker Dowd says he would prefer the governor get involved earlier, otherwise this thing may come off the rails.
Well, I think Speaker Dunn is absolutely right. I mean, the governor needs to be engaged. He's a very powerful player in this process, and there's no question he and his commissioners should be working with leaders at the Capitol to get something done, and that doesn't seem to be happening. So I know Republicans are eager to strike a deal. They understand they're going to have to compromise given a Democratic governor, but he absolutely needs to be more engaged.
Well, he should be engaged by giving the priorities. He has given his priorities, and now he needs to rank them and just say, this is the amount I really need. These are my top priorities. However, you can't negotiate against two parties that have the same position, but in different ways. That really puts him at a huge disadvantage, and you know that. So they've got to bring their people together into one position so he can negotiate it.
I don't agree with that. I mean, the governor's a very smart guy. His commissioners are very capable, and as a corporate lawyer myself, I've done plenty of deals where there's multiple parties, so it can be done and it should be done.
And maybe it would be helpful if he gave some input before they reached a compromise. Otherwise, you have to reach one compromise and then reach another compromise.
Priorities are important, but he has been pretty clear on those. As you had said earlier, he's giving in now pretty much on the gas tax, so where does he go from there? What are his priorities in that new world? And that's what I think he needs to portray.
And Andy, let's talk about transportation for a minute. How big of a deal is him quote-unquote giving in on the gas tax? Because I think he pretty much had to give in on it the moment the Republicans took control of the House and the Senate, because you knew there was no way they were going to approve a gas tax increase.
Well, I don't like necessarily characterizing it that way. I mean, I think compromise is a good thing. So my hat's off to the governor for realizing to get something done, he's going to have to compromise, and he did that. So, you know, I think it's a good decision. I think it's a smart move, but, you know, I don't think it takes anything away from him.
But now I think the Republicans have to realize that they cannot cut everything out of transit, because if you do that, you're going to have as many complaints from Republicans and Democrats when you have gridlock in the Twin Cities.
And is that maybe part of what the governor's strategy here is? He's saying he's giving in on the gas tax, which wasn't going to happen anyway, but in exchange, he's going to say, you're going to have to put in some money for transit, because, Andy, they're trying to do massive cuts to transit.
Well, I think it's about priorities. I mean, Republicans are committed to roads and bridges, and that's where we want to see the money spent. So there's going to have to be some compromise on the Republicans' part. They understand that. They should understand that.
But the cuts are also in metro mobility and other transportation services, special services, so these are really big cuts.
All right, and about 4 weeks to go. It's going to get interesting at the state capitol. Ember and Andy, thanks for being here. We're going to be back in 90 seconds. Stay tuned. All week, Minnesotans have been celebrating the life and legacy of Prince, 1 year after his death due to an accidental overdose. I spent some time with a man who mentored Prince in the early stages of his music career.
That's Prince.
Pepe Willie is a music producer who had a band at 94 East back in the 1970s. Prince played guitar on a few songs the band recorded after Willie acted as a mentor for the then 17-year-old musician. Prince's death hit Willie hard, even though he hadn't been close to him in recent years.
Every musician around the world admired Prince. They loved him, and they miss him. I miss him.
And of course, Paisley Park has been a busy place this weekend for the many fans who miss him. You can see my full story with Pepe Willie now on KSTP.com. And that's all the time we have for now. We'll see you back here again next week for another edition of At Issue.